Hello, this is another one of my videos on Alistair Parker's short introduction to the Second World War, this one dealing with the individual economy of Germany during the war. This is from chapter 9, which is quite a long chapter, so I've divided it into a number of separate videos. Parker describes Germany as the powerhouse of aggressive war. When the war began, few Germans were out of work, I would add, excluding Jews and many women. Thus, the Wehrmacht was limited in its weapons acquisitions to what could be then produced. There were only four ways to get more. One, increased productivity. Workers could work harder. Managers could manage better. Two, unemployed men and women could be brought into the workforce, effectively reversing the former Nazi policy of encouraging women to be homemakers rather than in the workforce. Three, resources could be diverted from civilian products by the government. And four, armed conquest of labor and raw materials. So recruitment into the armed forces made industrial production more difficult. By May 1940, 4 million German men had been removed from the labor force, and by September 1944, this had risen to 11 million. Despite this removal of manpower, German munitions production steadily increased from 1939 up to 1944, by which time it had increased by fivefold. Hitler had already both emphasized the need for self-sufficiency and repeatedly demanded the increased output of weapons. The weapons available in 1939, 1940, and 1941 were adequate for the conquests of those years. That's Poland, Norway, France, and the Low Countries, the Balkans, and much of European Russia. Only then did the demand for more weapons mount, and Hitler's earlier toleration of constraints on production cease. The most powerful constraint on increased production was Hermann Göring, initially the second most powerful man in Germany and in overall charge of the economy, who was able to block the proposals of those in the Nazi apparatus whom he saw as rivals. But as Göring's power lessened and the need for effective organization of production became more pressing, many of his functions were transferred to others. First, Fritz Todt, the Minister of Armaments and Munitions, from March 1940 until his death in February 1942, and then his successor, Albert Speer. Todt and Speer together brought manufacturers into discussions on economic priorities and resource allocations, reduced the power of military customers, and curbed their ignorant interference, those are Parker's words, in production procedures. Until 1942, the Army, Air Force, Navy, and civilian sectors all competed for resources. Orders overlapped and might exceed what could be produced over several years, emphasis shifting from one item to another. Scarce materials leaked into inessential ones, and different services didn't agree on interchangeable parts. By contrast, after 1942, competing orders were reduced and balanced with the available labor and materials. There was less ordered, but more was received. At least until the end of 1941, it seemed certain that Germany would win the war. But as this certainty ended, new efforts were needed to prevent defeat. The government tried to get more Germans to work so as to accelerate production. In January 1943, all men aged 60 to 65 and all women aged 17 to 45 were told to register. Although 3.5 million people registered, only 1/5 were actually placed in work. The Nazis believed that in World War I, domestic discontent had defeated Germany, so they would try to make the war more comfortable for civilians. Theoretically, they also objected to women working, though in fact, eventually, as high a proportion of women in Germany worked as in Britain. The Nazis failed to force women to change jobs or compel a high proportion of non-employed women to take jobs. This was partly because many women already worked on small farms or had young children, and partially because women whose husbands were in the forces received allowances that were so generous that there was less incentive to work. Unlike Britain, where nearly all women who had been in domestic service moved into war work, the number of German women in domestic service at the end of the war was as high as at the beginning. The regime shifted from civilian to military production in order to meet its needs. In 1939, 58% of non-agricultural labor was working for the home market, but by 1944, this had decreased to 41%. Working hours were also lengthened and productivity grew. German strength in machine tools helped. In 1943, there was only one machine tool for 2.35 workers in relevant industries, compared to 1.5.7 in Britain. For extra war labor, Germany increasingly relied on foreigners, some voluntary, but most forced, consisting of prisoners of war, deportees, or slaves. Some of these were treated well, but others suffered from overwork and malnutrition. By the end of 1944, 1.6 million prisoners of war were working in Germany, along with 6 million other foreigners, about 2 million being women. In 1943, over 750,000 workers came from France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, many of them conscripted. These countries were the major sources for new skilled and semi-skilled labor for German industry. Most of the workers from Poland, Russia, and the East, including women, were unskilled. Over 2,750,000 men and women were carried off to Germany from the Soviet Union. The people of the occupied countries also helped to feed Germany, providing 1/3 of its bread, meat, and fat. Their own consumption was correspondingly depressed. Standard rations in the occupied areas in the West in 1943 were about 1,500 calories per day, compared to 2,000 in Germany itself, while in Poland and German-occupied areas of the Soviet Union, they were in the region of 800 to 850 calories a day. In 1943, Germany took about 40% of French industrial production. In 1942-43, French factories produced over 50,000 trucks for the Germans, who also bought 15,000 used trucks. French industry mostly turned out non-military stores for the Wehrmacht and German civilians. The Germans preferred to keep more advanced industrial production within the Reich, including aircraft, and whilst the German Air Force got 2,500 aircraft from France, most were transports and trainers. French engineering workers, who were used to produce combat aircraft, did so in German factories. Germany lacked sufficient natural resources, especially metals and minerals. Crippling shortages were prevented through stockpiling, imports from neighboring countries, seizures in occupied areas, and blockade running. Göring's four-year plan organization sponsored whole new industries to cope with shortages of iron ore, oil and rubber. Steelworks able to use low-grade home-produced iron ore. Production of synthetic oil and rubber with the help of the IG Farben chemical group. In 1938, only 5% of rubber used in Germany was synthetic, but by 1943 this had risen to 94%. Synthetic oil consumption quadrupled from 1938 to 1944. Only 16% of oil consumption in 1938, but 56% by early 1944. But this was not enough. Except for its armoured and motorised divisions, the pre-war German army relied on horse-drawn transport beyond its railheads. This remained the case throughout the war. Thus, with their Lend-Lease trucks and ample supplies of fuel, the Soviets became more mobile than the Germans, who lost their early advantage, even in summer campaigns. As early as 1942, the Luftwaffe cut its training for pilots because of shortages of aviation fuel, a weakness which enabled the Allies to decisively reduce German mobility in the West in 1944. To fight a two-front war, Hitler needed larger stocks and much longer preparation. But he could not delay because after 1938, France, Britain and Russia were all rapidly gaining strength. As a result, Hitler set off to challenge the world's other great powers, a challenge that was doomed to fail because of Germany's shortage in economic resources, unless rapid conquest brought speedy amelioration. It didn't, and successful Soviet resistance exposed the essential German weaknesses, a lack of natural resources, and ultimately a people, such that in the end the German armed forces ran short of the skilled, intelligent and fit young men needed to fight a war against its rising opponents. By 1944, as an instance, the average age of German soldiers was 31.5, 6 years older than the American army. So thank you for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement, without which I wouldn't be able to make these videos. If you want to support my channel, you're very welcome to do so. Please like, comment and share on the videos. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. Ring the bell button if you want a notification. Patreon and PayPal links are given below if you want to provide practical support. Next week we'll talk about the Soviet Union in this section on individual national economies. Have a good day.